And so we have Halevy, we have Halivni, and now integrating those two diverse theories in the model that you developed. How does that work?
So the model to develop is because I come from a traditional way, right? So I do believe, I think it's extremely important to maintain Rav Shira Gaon and etc. and the rules. And you have to just reinterpret. And I think that Halivni open, I do go with first of all, the contributions. My book is basically an analysis. What are the contributions of Halevy that we should keep, that there is validity? And my view is the role of Abai Verava, that he says that they did put the traditions together, I think is extremely important and it's extremely valid. But the Talmud was oral, meaning we do not have any recordings of real written works until the end of the 8th century, beginning of the 9th century. And it makes sense, right? It's also an oral work. And today we know that every single manuscript that we have that we dated, it's basically from that period. And we know that in the context of Islam, also the Islamic periods in Iraq, which was Babylonia, also got into writing. The first paper mills come at that time. So the reality of it is that I was written much later. So it was an oral work. So you could take Halevy's basic premise that Abai Verava collected the traditions and traditions were learned collectively. And the truth is, there is already many proofs for that. Number one, the way the recording of transmissions shows that. Not only that, the Geonim themselves say that until Abai Verava, the process of halacha was determined by earlier generations. When a student argued with his master, the halacha was ein halacha ketalmid makom. The student can never prevail over his rabbi, over his master. So you always went backwards. But amazingly enough, the Abai Verava switches. Now, if a student argues with his rabbi, halacha kebatrai follows the later generations. And what happened? So the Marik explains that, the same idea, because until Abai Verava, you learn from your specific rabbi. So therefore, you could never be bigger than who you learn from. But now you're learning from the collective, right? You're learning from the collective tradition. The collective kept growing. So the collective later generations had a bigger rabbi. So therefore, the halacha, so it follows. Now, Rav Ashi clearly, and I think it's very demonstrated, and I show in my book, that Rav Ashi had this role. I'm not sure if he did editing. I don't think he did editing, but he did create a second version, a cleaner version, in some local editing of Abai's idea. And he collected something called the Proto-Talmud. That is the Proto-Talmud, which is very distinct. It's Amoraic, meaning it's attributed. It's mostly in Hebrew. And it's like Halivni says, and Halivni is right, the rulings of the Amoraim are very different. They are apodictic. Apodictic is something used in New Testament history, is the idea of very clear, defined short statements. And you see that, and you could see very clear. And that was maintained and memorized at the beginning of the 6th century by something called the Tanaim in the academies. But I think the interpretation always took place. And the interpretation are called the Savory. And my view is that you could apply Halivni. The Savoraim are not a category of people like a chronology. Clearly, they are the ones with the most of the work is between the end of the Talmud in the 5th century, in the 6th century, and the Geonim, because they are the only ones in place. That's why it's called the Savoric age. But I proved that the Savorim existed throughout, even much later. And the Savorim were the interpreters. There was always a commentary, like our scroll, right? The interprets the Gemara. There was oral interpretation. The difference is the oral interpretation, number one, was anonymous because it was a growing process, like a snowball. It was a hierarchical structure, right? That goes and it becomes more and more complex as it evolves over time. And there are today oral traditions in Indonesia who do that. There is a fixed text and a text of interpretations evolves over time. And that's the Savoric work. And that's the stam of the Gemara. What Halivni always goes this focus on the anonymous part of the Talmud, which is interpretations of the Amoraim. And he says, because they reconstructed the Amoraim, I say it's not reconstructed. The Amoraim were there. They reinterpret the Amoraim. They try to reconcile. So they take the work of Rav Ashi, which are called the Proto-Talmud, and they write a oral interpretation. So the Talmud was written, was put it together. But you could see, today you could discern the Amoraic work, which is the Halevy's contribution. It's very defined. You could see that it's in Hebrew, it's apodictic, it's attributed. And then you have the interpretations. So the interpretations are not a reconstruction, they are reinterpretation. And that kept evolving over time until the Talmud is written. Because once you write, now you know that basically it can continue. Because if you continue evolving, people will say, 1 second, this doesn't fit what it was before. In a world of oral, you could continue developing interpretation, and people don't realize that you're changing because there are no tape recorders. But once you have written, you have this evidence. And you see that. You see that even written works by the earlier commentators before Rashi, which was a Nissim Gaon school and Rabbeinu Hananel and Rabbeinu Gershom school, continue the same way. They also continue writing interpretations, almost like a paraphrase of the Talmud, even when it was already written after the 10th, 11th, 12th century. So that's my view. My view is that the Talmud today is based of two works. Basically, it's a combination. The Moraic work, which is in Hebrew, apodictic, it follows Halevy, and the Stama Gemara, the anonymous, which is Halevy's contribution, is not a reconstruction work, but a work of reinterpretation. In some ways, this is similar to the work of Shama Friedman, who was a contemporary, who is alive, and he was at the same time learning from Shaul Lieberman, and also focused on the anonymous part of the Talmud, but he also thinks that this is an interpretation, not a reconstruction. And that's what I think, and it works extremely well. And that's why you see that the Rishonim had a issue of what's the halachic authority of that anonymous interpretation. So the Rif in Chulin actually writes that is more authoritative than the Moraim. You know why? Because it's later. And the halacha followed the later authorities, but right. So you see clearly not like Halevy, because the Talmud continued to evolve. The Rambam, I have my proofs, and my Maimonides holds that the acceptance, the communal acceptance, they gave authority to the Talmud was only in the Amoraic statements and rulings, not in the interpretations. That's why the Rambam, Maimonides, feels liberty to interpret the Amoraim different to the Talmud in its anonymous voice interprets, because it says it was never accepted.